Trump hands out hoagies and reassurances in storm-battered Florida. President Trump traveled to Florida on Thursday to take part in what has quickly become a familiar tableau for him, the windbreaker-clad commander-in-chief, surveying hurricane devastation, bucking up local officials, and alighting from his helicopter to distribute food and handshakes. This time, it was Naples, the Gulf Coast town of multimillion-dollar seafront villas and inland mobile home parks that was torn asunder by Hurricane Irma. Mr. Trump stopped at one of the latter, where an excavator was removing the twisted remains of a mobile home. "Don't forget to take one," the president said to a friendly crowd as he stood behind a silver tin of hoagies, part of a staging area with food and water for resident and rescue workers. "Here's a nice one." Mr. Trump arrived in Naples after he was briefed in nearby Fort Myers on the recovery operation by federal emergency management and Florida officials, including Senator Marco Rubio, Governor Rick Scott, and Pam Bondi, the state attorney general. It was Mr. Trump's third visit to storm-ravaged parts of the United States in the past few weeks after two major hurricanes, and he again praised the federal government's performance. "We are doing a good job in Florida," Mr. Trump said to reporters on Air Force One. "We are going to see some of the folks and make sure they're happy," he said in Fort Myers, acknowledging that many had lost their homes in the destruction. At the mobile home park, called Naples Estates, Mr. Trump was in his element. Many of the residents had voted for him, and as on a previous trip to hurricane-scarred Texas, where he marveled at the size of a crowd that had turned out for him, he mixed words of encouragement for their ruined houses with glee at their signs of support. When one man shouted, "Where was Obama during the last hurricane?" on a golf course, Mr. Trump stopped and asked whether he had voted for him, according to a White House Mule report. "Best vote of your life?" the president said, with a grin. After Mr. Trump left, another resident, Kathy Rice, beamed as she drove her golf cart back toward her home. "The president," she proclaimed to neighbors lingering around, "touched my dog." Mr. Trump had leaned over to pet the dog, a 3-year-old Chihuahua mix, as residents gathered to receive the hoagies, a mix of cheese and either turkey, roast beef or ham, bananas and bottled water. He complimented Ms. Rice on her black Bikers for Trump shirt. "The bikers love us," Mr. Trump said, clapping her on the shoulder with a broad grin. "They're everything I thought they would be," Ms. Rice said later, referring to the president and the First Lady, Melania Trump. Nancy Newkirk, a pencil wedged under her bandana, stood outside her home smoking a cigarette. The 67-year-old, who works as a meat cutter in a grocery store, did not get to greet the president personally. "But it meant a lot," she said, "that Mr. Trump had come to their complex. He actually saw for his own eyes," Ms. Newkirk said. "This is Naples Estates, and it's trashed." Part of the roof of her mobile home had collapsed, weighed down by water still collecting in the storm's aftermath. Water left brown stains on the ceiling that still remained. A musty smell clung to the home she and her husband, Dave, had lived in since 2009. But they still fared better than some of their neighbors, who lost their houses and possessions. Hurricane Irma left the Florida Keys with the most damage, but it battered all of South Florida and left millions without power across the southeast. 8 people died in a nursing home in Hollywood, Florida, and others were hospitalized after the storm knocked out air conditioning. In Naples, streets are flooded, with water pooling around piles of debris that include broken fences, tables, and trees. Every home has its own pile: broken trees, pieces of roofing, and metal slats. One home had a "for sale" sign in the window and exposed pink insulation on the roof. As of Wednesday, at least 14 other deaths in Florida, 6 in South Carolina and Georgia and 38 across the Caribbean had been attributed to the storm. Some 600 shelters have been opened in Florida, Governor Scott said. The governor praised the federal government for its swift response to the storm. Officials from the military and the Coast Guard were constantly calling and asking what resources they could provide to help the state, he said. For Mr. Trump, his aides said, the back-to-back hurricanes offered a chance to immerse himself in the details of major logistical operations. They have also been a welcome shift in focus from the storms inside the White House, which consumed the first 6 months of his presidency. The visit on Thursday was the president's first to Florida since the storm. Mr. Trump traveled to Texas and Louisiana this month after Hurricane Harvey to see the rescue efforts there. In his tweets and public statements, the president has often marveled at the size of the storms, drawing criticism from some that he initially said little about the human suffering left in their wake. "We had two massive hurricanes, the likes of which, I guess, our country has never seen," he said on Wednesday while meeting with members of Congress. "I don't think they have ever seen. One was the biggest ever in water and the other was the biggest ever in wind." Even on Thursday, Mr. Trump adapted uneasily to the role of aid worker. At the staging center in Naples Estates, he picked up a banana and asked whether anybody wanted one. He tried, but failed, to put on a pair of thin white plastic gloves to serve the hoagies. "They're too small," Mr. Trump said of the gloves, which ripped along his thumb, exposing skin. Florida Historic Capitol Museum opens exhibit that revisits pivotal points in history. This week's edition spotlighted the Florida Historic Capitol Museum's Changing America exhibit and history hop happening on Thursday, September 14th at 5 p.m. and continuing until October. The Changing America exhibit is presented by the Smithsonian's National Museum of African American History and Culture and the National Museum of American History in collaboration with the American Library Association Public Programs Office. The History Hop is an opportunity for attendees to explore some important national events surrounding the Emancipation Proclamation, the March on Washington, and travel to historic locations to hear some of Tallahassee's unique Civil War and civil rights stories. President Donald Trump doled out hoagies and handshakes in the sweltering Florida heat on Thursday as he took a first-hand tour of Irma's devastation and liberally dispensed congratulatory words about the federal and state recovery effort. Trump, who was in and out of the state in about 3 hours, got an aerial view of the water-deluged homes along Florida's southwestern coast from his helicopter, then drove in his motorcade along streets lined with felled trees, darkened traffic lights and shuttered stores on his way to a mobile home community hit hard by the storm. Walking along a street in Naples Estates with his wife, Melania, the president encountered piles of broken siding and soggy furniture sitting on a front porch, and residents and volunteers who were happy to get a presidential visit. "We are there for you 100%, Trump said before donning gloves and helping to hand out sandwiches to local residents from a lunch line under a canopy. "I'll be back here numerous times. This is a state that I know very well." As he left the state, Trump told reporters on Air Force One that he planned another hurricane-related trip to Puerto Rico and the U.S. Virgin Islands, which were both badly hit by Irma. "I spoke to both governors. We've got it very well covered," Trump said. Virgin Islands was really hit. "They were hit about as hard as I've ever seen." The president brushed off a question about whether the recent hurricanes had made him rethink his views on climate change, which he has previously dismissed as a hoax. He said, "If you go back into the 1930s and the 1940s, and you take a look, we've had storms over the years that have been bigger than this." Trump earlier met with federal and state leaders in Fort Myers, where he was brimming with enthusiasm for the state and federal response effort, calling it a team like very few people have seen. The president couldn't resist injecting a political flavor into his visit, telling reporters in Fort Myers that he was hopeful that Florida Gov. Rick Scott, a two-term Republican, would run for the Senate, where Democrat Bill Nelson is up for re-election next year. "I don't know what he's going to do, but I know at a certain point it ends for you and we can't let it end. So I hope he runs for the Senate," Trump said. Trump's visit offered him the chance to see how people are coping with Irma's aftermath and how the Federal Emergency Management Agency is responding. Many Florida residents remain swamped and without electricity. Nearly 2.7 million homes and businesses, about 1 in 4 Florida customers, were still without power Thursday. But as Trump's comments about Scott suggested, politics wasn't far from the surface in Florida, the largest and most pivotal state in recent presidential elections. Trump defeated Democrat Hillary Clinton in Florida last year by about 1 percentage point. Vice President Mike Pence, who joined Trump on the trip, promised Floridians, "We're with you today. We're going to be with you tomorrow, and we're going to be with you until Florida rebuilds bigger and better than ever before." Trump's trip to Florida was his third in less than 3 weeks to the storm-ravaged South. After Harvey struck Texas, Trump drew criticism for having minimal interaction with residents during his first trip in late August. He saw little damage and offered few expressions of concern. On his second visit, to Texas and Louisiana, he was more hands-on. He toured a Houston shelter housing hundreds of displaced people and walking streets lined with soggy, discarded possessions. This time, Trump made sure to connect with a community in recovery. He hewed toward hearty handshakes and enthusiastic promises rather than hugs and tears, but he was well received by people grappling with the storm. Florida's southwestern coast is a haven for retirees seeking warm weather and beautiful sunsets across the Gulf of Mexico. In Lee County, which includes Cape Coral and Fort Myers, the Florida Emergency Management Agency said 66% of the area's 290,000 electrical customers were still without power Wednesday. Widespread outages led to long lines outside of the relatively few stores, gas stations and restaurants that had reopened. The situation was even worse to the south in Collier County, home to Naples. Days after Irma passed, almost 80% of homes and businesses were still without electricity, and floodwater still covered some communities entirely. Walking through mobile homes ravaged by Hurricane Irma in Naples, Florida, President Trump praised first responders and residents for doing an incredible job on rescue and recovery. Earlier in his one-day visit to Florida, Trump also lauded state and federal officials for their preparation and response to the hurricane. "We love the people of Florida, and they went through something that, I guess, the likes of which we could really say nobody's ever seen before," Trump said in Naples. He spoke with at least one resident who was working to rebuild his house and served sandwiches. The surrounding area was littered with downed trees and ripped-out signs. Mobile homes were totaled, and tarps covered roofs, according to pool reports. Gas stations along the way advertised that they didn't have fuel. Trump's praise, he said, is not just for rescue workers but includes the people who live here. "You see people immediately getting back to work to fix up their homes." Standing before rescue helicopters and personnel at a hangar earlier in the day in Fort Myers, Florida, Trump also heaped praise on the state and local officials standing with him. "It's a team like very few people have seen," Trump said, referring to Florida Gov. Rick Scott, Senator Marco Rubio and State Attorney General Pam Bondi as well as FEMA Administrator Brock Long. "We're going to be there. We're with you today. We're going to be with you tomorrow," Trump said. Trump and Vice President Pence met with Scott and greeted rescue workers. The president also used the opportunity to encourage Scott to run for the Senate. "What do I know, but I hope this man right here runs for the Senate," he said. Trump pledged to come back to Florida numerous times. "We are there for you 100%, he said, adding, "This is a state that I know very well. These are special people and we love them." Gov. Rick Scott is again weathering criticism over global warming in the wake of Hurricane Irma, and won't say if he believes man-made climate change is real. "Clearly our environment changes all the time, and whether that's cycles we're going through or whether that's man-made, I wouldn't be able to tell you which one it is," Scott said after twice touring the storm-ravaged Florida Keys this week. "But I can tell you this, we ought to go solve problems. I know we have beach renourishment issues. I know we have flood mitigation issues." In not taking a position on climate change, Scott's views and responses to questions about climate change have remained markedly steady for years. The only major difference, for instance, between his comments Wednesday evening to reporters and his statements before his 2014 re-election is that he no longer said, "I'm not a scientist." Before that, in his first election in 2010, Scott clearly denied the idea of anthropogenic global warming. "I've not been convinced that there's any man-made climate change," Scott said then. "Nothing's convinced me that there is." Scott this week mentioned man-made changes to our environment when asked about climate change, but he did so in the context of his concerns over the stability of the Herbert Hoover Dike, which helps state officials manage water in South Florida. Similarly, in 2014, Scott addressed questions about climate change by instead talking about the money his administration has spent addressing floods, repacking beaches with sand or managing the Everglades. Scott might run for office again next year against U.S. Senator Bill Nelson, Democrat Florida, who took a veiled shot at the governor just after Irma left the state. "It's denying reality," Nelson told Politico on Tuesday. "You can call it politics or whatever, but the earth is getting hotter. This storm is another reminder of what we're going to have to deal with in the future." Nelson said that climate change is certainly going to be an important issue, and if certain people such as the one you mentioned is my opponent, there's a significant contrast in what we believe. And he said that 99.5% of climate scientists believe in man-made climate change. Scott was also criticized in 2015 after the Florida Center for Investigative Reporting reported that his Department of Environmental Protection banned the use of the terms climate change and global warming, but Scott denied that he issued such an edict. Before and after Irma, which first struck the Florida Keys on Sunday, Scott was bashed in a series of opinion pieces in state and national media with headlines like "GOP denies climate change, America pays the price, Florida governor has ignored climate change risks." Critics say, climate deniers play politics with looming natural disasters, or editorial, Governor Scott's Irma leadership undercut by his climate denial. Still, the relationship between global warming and hurricanes isn't straightforward. While it's true that hurricanes are essentially heat engines that thrive off warm water, more heat hasn't clearly led to more storms, although it may have led to more intense hurricanes, but not by a big amount. With a few exceptions, the large majority of studies in the last 10 years have indicated that under global warming, the numbers of hurricanes would stay the same or decrease, with a small increase in the intensity of the strongest storms, said David S. Nolan, chair of the University of Miami's Department of Atmospheric Sciences. "As for Harvey and Irma, I think it is wrong to attribute any single event to global warming." Scott's close political ally, President Donald Trump, once called the concept of man-made climate change a hoax. When asked Thursday in Florida if Irma and Hurricane Harvey, which struck Texas, changed his views on the matter, Trump suggested the answer was no. "We've had bigger storms than this," the president said. But other Republicans, many from South Florida, including Miami-Dade County Mayor Carlos Jimenez and Reps. Carlos Curbelo and Elena Ros-Lehtinen, say man-made climate change is real and needs to be taken seriously. Nelson said it was ironic that climate change deniers don't believe the majority of climate scientists about global warming, but they rely on hurricane forecasts that the scientists have produced. Scott said he's instead focused on what we can solve and we have to go do it. He said the state should prioritize Irma relief and recovery efforts. "I think we ought to focus on the fact that we have a state that just went through a Category 4 storm," Scott said. "And we ought to get people their power back, most importantly, get their fuel back, and that's what we should focus on right now."